Hello, lovely listeners. Welcome back to the Skylight Books podcast series. My name is Mick. I'm the assistant events manager at Skylight Books and the producer for this podcast. We're back today with another wonderful new episode of SKYLIT, the series where we talk to authors and find out what makes their books tick. Today, it's very timely. We have a pre-Academy Award ceremony special. We have Michael Schulman, the author of Oscar Wars, here on the pod with us today in conversation with his fellow New Yorker writer Alex Ross. Michael Schulman is the author of the New York Times bestseller Her Again, Becoming Meryl Streep. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he has contributed since 2006. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and other publications. His latest book, as I mentioned, is Oscar Wars, A History of Hollywood in Gold, Sweat, and Tears. He currently lives in New York City. Alex Ross has been the music critic of The New Yorker since 1996. His first book, The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, was published in 2007 and won a National Book Critics Circle Award. It was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. An essay collection, Listen to This, appeared in 2010. His third book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, was published in 2020. Thank you both for being here. Alex, I'll let you take it away.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be here with Michael. Welcome back to Los Angeles virtually. I live in the area of Skylight Books most of the time with regular trips back to New York, and it's an absolutely fantastic store. It was part of the reason why I wanted to live in this neighborhood, actually, to begin with. So it's always great to be in association with this fantastic institution. Michael, we've known each other for many, many years in the hallowed halls of the New Yorker.
That's right.
It's a little less hallowed each time we move, but
right. So we date back to the glory days of 4 Times Square.
Right. Well, I go back even further. I go back to
you do.
Whatever it was, 43rd Street. But I think we'll mostly talk about your book, but it might also be fun to chat about being a New Yorker writer and writing books at the New Yorker, to the extent that people out there are curious about these odd creatures, the New Yorker writers. But yeah, let's start with the book, which I absolutely loved reading. I've been a fan of the Oscar ritual since I was a kid, and find I'm always incredibly excited each year, and then each time at the end of it, I'm always a little disappointed, but somehow that never spoils the expectation for the following year.
Isn't that just the story of life?
Yes, exactly. Just always kind of reaching. But I think it's like wanting to recapture the kind of version of it that I encountered when I was a kid.
When did you start watching? When was your?
Well, I don't remember exactly. I sometime in the. My parents weren't big TV watchers, so it was probably kind of in the early 80s or mid 80s. It started seeping into my consciousness. But yeah, I definitely go back to this kind of somewhat kitchified, kind of bloated, aging showbiz kind of incarnation of it, and I've always sort of regretted its various attempts to sort of become hip or sort of
that's
catch
so
up.
funny because I'm a little younger than you, and I started watching them in the early 90s, and I always think of that as the glory days with the Billy Crystal medleys. When I go back and watch the 80s ceremonies, they look so like archaic to me. Like they're still sort of trying to hold on to that era of like 1970s variety television, and they have these very gaudy opening numbers, one of which I read about in the book at length, the 1989 Notorious one with a woman's dressed as Snow White singing with Rob Lowe. But this always reminds me, like Lorne Michaels always says that people come up to him and they always say that the best era of Saturday Night Live was whenever they started watching as kids, as older kids. And I think that's probably true of the Oscars too.
Right. Although I feel like it was actually in the 90s that I became somewhat more addicted to it. I think because of the the sort of sense of ironic distance that Billy Crystal was able to create. So there was this sense that those are the sort of the shows that I vividly remember. But yeah, well, let's talk about the book and kind of what motivated you to sort of plunge into this, immense history to begin with. The sheer scope of the sort of performances under consideration, and sort of year after year, the Best Picture nominees and the actor nominees. What sort of led you to plunge in?
It actually grew out of a New Yorker piece. So in 2016, the Academy was reckoning with the Oscars So White hashtag movement. And the president of the Academy at the time was Cheryl Boone Isaacs, who was the first Black president of the Academy. And they came out with this initiative that they were going to diversify the membership, which got a lot of blowback from old timers, people who thought that the Academy was turning politically correct or whatever. A big part of this sort of dust up was that the Academy was not only going to bring in new, diverse, younger, more international members, but they were also going to demote certain people to emeritus status, which meant that you couldn't vote if you hadn't really worked in the industry for many years. And that just touched on this nerve in Hollywood. I think the greatest fear in Hollywood is the fear of obsolescence if you work in this industry. And so it just got under people's skin, and there was outcry. So I'm like one of the only people at the New Yorker who's really a junkie for the Oscars. Like at Vanity Fair, it's everyone there is such an Oscars nut, and I'm like one of the only people at our magazine who is really gunning to write about the Academy Awards. And so I pitched this story, and I went out to the Academy and met Cheryl Boone Isaacs and talked to all sorts of different members in the Academy and tried to capture what it was all about. And I learned a lot about Academy history while I was doing that. I mean, sort of what created the Academy in the first place. So this piece of mine comes out in February or so, shortly before the Oscars in 2017. And then I went to the Academy Awards for the first time to cover them for the magazine. And this was the year of the envelope mix-up with Moonlight and La La Land. So I was in the press room when that happened. So the first Academy Awards that I actually attended, something crazy and historic happened. And I sort of saw it as this incredible Hollywood twist ending to this epic year of, Hollywood, much like the rest of the country, having its version of a racial reckoning. And that's kind of where I got the idea to do a book that was not just a catalog of every year. Those books exist, the sort of yearbook years, but to choose about a dozen moments, years, even a single category that told some larger story about cultural change, and do it as in the form of kind of, long form narrative journalism that we do at the New Yorker. So it was kind of like about 12 New Yorker pieces is how I conceived it.
Right. I thought you pulled off a really nice balance. I mean, you give us all of the bonkers stories, or at least a lot of them, and the clash of personalities, and the backstage disasters, and the onstage disasters, and all that. But there is also this political or kind of sociological framing, so that you're using the ceremony at sort of different stages of its history to illustrate kind of larger cultural trends, as well as kind of just showing the history of Hollywood itself. And that's sort of in your subtitle, that it is a history of Hollywood, and you pack an enormous amount of movie history into the book, which I think is really deftly done. But going back to the beginning, I was really fascinated by your account of the origins of the thing, which I didn't know particularly well. And I mean, would it be going too far to characterize the sort of rationale for starting the Oscars or the Academy itself to begin with as a kind of union busting strategy? Or
in a way it was. Yeah, it was basically two things that were happening in 1920s Hollywood that gave rise to the Academy. One was that by and large the industry was not unionized. The craftspeople were, but not the actors, writers, directors. And yet Actors Equity was making inroads. Actors Equity was the union, fairly new at the time, for stage actors in the East. And so there were signs that, things might change. And people like Louis B. Mayer, who was the all-powerful head of MGM, realized that that would be pretty bad for him because he wanted, undiluted access to his workforce. And so one of the Academy's original um, purposes, awards were very far low down on the list of things that they wanted to do. Mostly what they wanted to do was resolve disputes. Publicly, they talked about how they wanted to create harmony among the various factions of the industry. So they arbitrated, labor disputes if someone was felt that they were not paid enough or unfairly fired. And they also oversaw contract negotiations. And they effectively ran Actors Equity out of town and delayed unionization for about 5 years until the Depression really jump-started the labor movement, and you had SAG and other guilds rise up, and then they became like the mortal enemies of the Academy because they saw the Academy as a company union. The other thing that was going on in 20s Hollywood was a real image problem, because earlier in the 20s, there had been this string of very salacious scandals like the trial of Fatty Arbuckle and the murder of William Desmond Taylor and, sex, drugs, murder, just all the time. And just like now, there was a culture war where half the country felt that, things had gotten too loose and unchristian, in the years after World War II, like this was the Roaring 20s. And, the same people who had lobbied for prohibition successfully then saw the movies as this thing that was corrupting the country. And so they saw Hollywood as this cesspool of sin. And there was a real threat of censorship laws. So the Academy was also geared toward fixing that problem, which was to sort of change the image of Hollywood from a cesspool to an academy. I mean, that sounds very lofty and important. And the Oscars kind of grew out of that second goal.
Right, which also kind of leads into the imposition of the code, kind of the gradual emergence of the code from 1930.
Yeah, that was all happening at the same time.
Yeah, all part of this sort of attempt to police itself, and also to kind of play some of the roles that you'd expect from a union. We'll take care of you, and also we'll hand out prizes, to make you feel good, so that it itself wouldn't be policed or sort of encroached upon by sort of larger forces. So it was kind of very ingenious move to create this kind of amorphous organization that has sort of become this colossus just by dint of sort of being there decade after decade. When you went back and sort of were watching some of these early sort of movies from the early years, and I kind of picture you just watching ridiculous numbers of movies, especially during the pandemic while you were working on this.
I watched some great movies.
Yeah. What are some of the ones that kind of surprised you? And because when we go back and look at the early years, I mean, I guess this applies to the Oscars, decade after decade, but sort of our sense of kind of the canon of movie history doesn't necessarily align with, what they were kind of handing out, awards to at the time. Although Sunrise, which is routinely, listed as one of the greatest movies ever made, F.W. Murnau's Sunrise, which I actually just saw at a screening at the Academy, which was fantastic. Nice. That was honored at the very first awards, if I remember.
Yeah.
Correctly.
So the very first Oscars in 1929 had two top prizes. One was for outstanding production, and that went to Wings, which is a big World War I battle movie in, it's like Star Wars, or like it's more like it's like a Top Gun of 1929. It's,
right.
Planes and bombings and, very technically ambitious. And then the other prize was for best unique and artistic picture, which went to Sunrise, which is like a smaller, more like a psychodrama, and doesn't have that, it's very technically impressive and innovative, but not in that gigantic way. I think what's interesting about that is that you still feel that tension at the Oscars between spectacle and, a sort of a smaller, quieter kind of movie. If you compare, like this year, we have Top Gun and Avatar, and on one side, and then like women talking, and what else? I like Tar on the other side.
Right.
So you
Maybe they should
still
bring
have
back
that
the
tension.
unique artistic category.
I mean, maybe.
That's-
Well, they've tried that, and a couple of years ago, they said they were going to start a category for best popular film, and
Right.
everyone
Yeah.
just laughed them into back into the hedges, and they just dropped the whole thing because but maybe that would be a better way to do it. I don't know. Like in any sense, like even if you look at years like 1953, which was the year that Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth won, this big dumb circus spectacular over High Noon. Like that's the
Mhm.
same dynamic. Like High Noon to me is like a perfect movie.
Right.
But the Oscar went to the big, loud spectacle.
Right.
So I think that's always happening in every era.
Yeah,
That
or
tension.
the 1951 Oscars, which just strikes me just kind of just the sort of height of absurdity, where for the Best Actress category, you had it was Norma Desmond versus Margot Channing. It was
Ah,
Gloria
yes.
Swanson from Sunset Boulevard and Betty Davis from All About Eve. Two of the absolutely most overpowering, unforgettable, female performances in movie history. The idea of like having to choose which of these is better, is ridiculous in itself. And then at neither of them was at the ceremony, and neither of them won.
I know.
Judy
And
Holliday won.
for Born Yesterday, and honestly, I'm okay with that. I
Yeah,
would
I
have
mean,
voted for Betty Davis as Margot Channing, which is one of my favorite movie performances ever. It's kind of shocking that she lost, but it's also kind of shocking that Gloria Swanson lost. Um, but I don't know, Judy Holliday is wonderful in Born Yesterday, and that's another sort of iconic role. And I
Mhm.
also feel like comedic parts never win Oscars. So, and she's so funny in that part. It was a star-making part for her.
Mhm.
She really should have had a bigger career, but she died shortly after cancer. But I don't know. I'm at peace with the fact that
Mhm.
she won that Best Actress
Right. It would have
prize.
been
But
too insulting to give it to either one of the others. So yeah.
yeah,
So,
but
but
it's quite a stacked category.
what are some other kind of discoveries that you made just exploring the byways of movie history, especially early on? Were there things that just really surprised you?
Well, there was one chapter that I saved to write for the end. I wrote the whole book out of order,
Mhm.
and then put it in chronological order. But the one that I put off because I was intimidated by it was the Blacklist chapter, because
Mhm.
I just thought this is such a dark, huge subject. Really the darkest chapter in Hollywood history. And how am I going to tackle this? And yet I had some sense. And in the end, I sort of found this like little forgotten Hollywood Oscar scandal that sort of opened up this caper, which was in 1957, um, the award for Best Motion Picture Story, a category that no longer exists, went to someone named Robert Rich. And Robert Rich was not there to receive it. It was for this movie called The Brave One. I mean, talk about the random movies that I watched for this
Mhm.
book. Like no one's ever heard of this movie. It's about a Mexican boy trying to save his bull. Um, and so Robert Rich could not be located. The producers of the movie said that he was an ex-GI who they met in Munich, and maybe he was in Europe somewhere. Maybe he was in Australia. We don't know. Life magazine actually ran an illustration of Robert Rich based on their descriptions of him. It's such a great article because it's all about this phantom winner. And it turned out that it was Dalton Trumbo, the famously blacklisted screenwriter who had been part of the Hollywood 10. He had served prison already. And then he self-exiled to Mexico and got this idea for the movie, but he was writing under fake names on the black market. And once he won, he realized that he could use this press hubbub to turn the tables on the Academy and on the blacklist and try to destroy the blacklist by essentially creating a PR crisis for
Mhm.
the Oscars. And it's like such a fun story because so much of the blacklist is so depressing, but here's this you know eccentric writer who would type in his bathtub on his typewriter, just sort of using his wit and his cleverness and his words and scheming from behind that typewriter to like destroy his enemies. And he kind of succeeded. He famously broke the blacklist when he got a credit on the movies Exodus and Spartacus in 1960. So I love learning about that sort of secret history of the 1950s Oscars and how this little weird moment of this mystery man winning a minor award can open up this epic, tale of like this caper, really.
Right.
It's like this adventure story of how these screenwriters sort of fought back.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it is a perfect example of sort of Oscar ridiculousness that also has a sort of heavy political kind of undertow to it. But yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the Blacklist too, because the project that I'm currently working on, which has entailed watching a huge number of fairly obscure movies, is about German-speaking emigres in Southern California from the 20s, through to the early 50s, essentially movies, literature, music, and architecture. And so I've been reading a lot of the stories around High Noon, which was directed by emigre director Fred Zinnemann. And it was especially bleak for the emigres who had fled Nazi Germany and Nazi domination of Europe to come here and then to be persecuted all over again.
And Bertolt Brecht was one of the original people dragged before HUAC.
Yeah, and he fled the next day.
And he just said, "Yeah, I'm going home. Goodbye." The Hollywood 10 went to prison, and Bertolt Brecht was just out of there.
Yeah, Hans Eisler, who had been having a composer who had been having a pretty successful career, or kind of up and down career as a film composer, was also forced to leave. So it's very, very bleak stories. But
I have a question for you, Alex. Have you ever seen the movie Salt of the Earth?
Yes.
From the 50s?
Yes. I'd have to it'll probably take a moment for all the details to come forward about it.
It was made by a bunch of blacklisted people,
Yeah,
including
right,
Michael
right,
Wilson,
yeah.
who I write about.
Yeah.
And it's sort of about a real strike in, I think it's Arizona or New Mexico. And it's all about these Chicano workers. And it's a cast of it's a movie from the 50s. It very much feels like a movie from the 50s, except it's about something that no Hollywood movies from the 50s are about, which is like people of color, women. It's like a very feminist, pro-labor movie. I mean, it was made outside of the Hollywood system because it was this group of blacklisted people. I think one of them said something like, "We wanted a crime worth the punishment," like they had been blamed for, there was so much paranoia that Hollywood screenwriters were, infiltrating and spreading communist propaganda through the movies, which if you watch any 50s Hollywood movies is completely absurd. They're not exactly, the Communist Manifesto, but this movie sort of is, and it's like this very leftist film. And it's sort of shocking to watch that. When you asked me about some of the surprises in terms of movies I watched, this one was really unlike anything else I'd ever seen, because we're just not used to seeing a movie with leftist politics and feminist and Chicano characters like in a black and white 50s movie.
Yeah, you see to some extent in the kind of mid 30s, sort of late 30s, kind of leftist agenda sort of coming to the fore, but very often in a very restrained, kind of submerged way, where you have a movie about the Spanish Civil War where the actual circumstances of the war is sort of barely mentioned, and it's just all about the love story or some kind of basic conflict. But nonetheless, they were trying. William Dieterle made these movies in the 30s. But I was also thinking about, I mean, how far back do kind of recordings, film and recordings of the ceremonies go? Like, what's the kind of earliest you can actually experience the Oscars in action?
Well, I didn't find any recordings of the first year, but then it started getting carried on radio. So there's some audio recordings. By the 40s or so, the Academy was filming them, but they weren't being televised. And also newsreels would film something. So like the reason you can watch Hattie McDaniel give her historic speech for Gone with the Wind when she was the first Black person to win an Oscar is because they sort of did it for the newsreels. And then the Academy has on their YouTube page very early ceremonies. It's just like a one big wide shot, like you can see 1951, even though it was on TV, they captured it for archival reasons, I guess. And then it started getting televised in 1953, that same year that The Greatest Show on Earth won. It was sort of the moment you could see the Academy Awards, you could see how wrong they got it. This is also the same year that Singing in the Rain didn't even get nominated for Best Picture, so it was a wrong year all around.
Right.
But that was the first sort of that was the first time it was on TV, and the Academy really resisted putting the awards on television because in the early years of television, TV was seen as the enemy of movies,
Right.
and no one was quite sure would the movies survive television. So it seemed sort of perverse to put the Academy Awards on TV. And yet they did it eventually because they were the Academy was in dire financial straits and kind of needed the money, and they still make most of their money from selling the rights to TV.
Right. And I guess in theory, it would have turned into a advertisement for the movies themselves, although you can kind of debate how much real sort of box office impact the ceremonies had. And certainly there are cases where a sort of lesser known movie got a very strong boost from the Oscars, but then, you know, the sort of basic economics of Hollywood have not really been that dependent.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah. But I guess, I mean, we'd always have to remember with these awards and what they quote unquote get wrong, or you know, is, I mean, that it is like these are industry awards, you know, and so it has so much to do not with the kind of pure abstract quality of the films or the performances as judged by, you know, sort of completely disinterested observers, but, you know, these are co-workers, you know, and colleagues. So of course personalities come into play, and these sort of rhythms of who is sort of feels due for an award at any given moment, and that kind of ebb and flow.
Oh yeah, I mean, I always say that if you look to the Oscars as a barometer of cinematic worth, you're going to be perpetually disappointed or enraged.
Right.
But if you look at them as a kind of window into how the industry sees itself, then they're very interesting. But you know, there's at the heart of the Oscars is a fallacy, which is that you can rank art, which you can't. You know, art isn't meant to be ranked. There is no best picture. There's no best actor. It's like, that's not a thing. It's a completely subjective. It's just the sum of a lot of people's opinions who are very interested in, you know, interested in the sense that they're interested parties. They work in the industry. So they're, you know, and then of course with the rise of modern campaigning, there's a million different factors that go into who wins and who loses and who gets nominated. It's, you know, it has so much to do with who has a campaign budget and a marketing department, and who people think, you know, should win because they've worked a long time and they haven't won yet. So yeah, I mean, I think part of the Academy Awards is that they're absurd, and that's the fun of it. And it's fun to like, movies shouldn't be ranked, but they should be discussed. And I feel like the part of the appeal of the Oscars is that we can all sort of argue about what they're getting wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in terms of campaigning, I mean, you have this really fascinating and also unsettling chapter about Harvey Weinstein and the great sort of debacle of Saving Private Ryan versus Shakespeare in Love. But you know, how early did kind of conscious campaigning begin? Because I certainly have the sense of, you know, from the early years, reading biographies and sort of histories that they really weren't taken that seriously, you know, by the performers themselves. Or, you know, they would be, you know, delighted if they won and very disappointed if they didn't. But the idea of campaigning would have been pretty foreign, it feels like.
Oh yeah.
People
well, the first official like campaign ad was placed in the 30s by Louis B. Mayer for a movie called All Wilderness, and it showed like Leo the lion, for, you know, the mascot of MGM, like grabbing an Oscar or something. It was like so blatant. And the movie was nominated, so it didn't do anything. But you know, like, yeah, campaigns were nothing like they were after Weinstein. They were really, you know, people would place ads, they would have maybe some cocktail parties and screenings at people's homes in Beverly Hills, and but there wasn't this jockeying and politicking. That was really Weinstein coming in, and, you know, he saw himself as an underdog because they were the New York company, they were the indie company. they came out with these edgy movies like The Crying Game and Pulp Fiction. And so he really felt justified in doing absolutely everything, leaving no stone unturned to get these movies Oscars, because that was his whole strategy for keeping this company afloat. And the finances of Miramax were always a mess. Like they were always constantly on the verge of going bankrupt until they were bought by Disney. And so that's what they did. And once Weinstein did it, especially for Shakespeare in Love, then everyone else in Hollywood realized that they had to copy what he was doing, the so-called Weinstein playbook, to keep up. It was like this arms race. So then suddenly you had everyone hiring tons of consultants, having nonstop events and press and calling voters and la 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 la. And that's how you got this bloated ecosystem where millions and millions of dollars are spent, and people spend months and months just only working on the Oscars.
Right. Yeah. It just seems like such a waste. I mean, to watch, the supremely talented Cate Blanchett, devoting months of her precious career to just going to events and giving interviews and going to screenings. It just seems like, I mean, is there any way this could ever be reined back, or is it kind of this?
Well, it has actually been reined back.
Right.
Like since the heyday of, I would like the 2000s, when Miramax had really created this model that everyone else was trying to recreate. The Academy realized that they had to step in and regulate this. Like there's a quote from one of the administrators from the Academy in 1999, the heat of all the Shakespeare in Love stuff, where he said, well, we don't want to be Big Brother. Well, eventually the Academy realized they had to be Big Brother, and they started writing rules to stop whatever people were coming up with. So for instance, now you can't have a reception if you don't have a screening in the same venue. So there used to be a lot more like luncheons and parties where you could come. Maybe you would go 10 blocks away and see a screening afterward. Maybe you wouldn't. And people would Academy members could go from basically Thanksgiving through March without paying for a meal, because they just go to these constant, like schmoozing events. Right. So that has actually been reined in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little bit like campaign finance reform, I suppose.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very much like campaign finance reform for political presidential politics. And you also have like the sort of, instead of primary states, you have like the BAFTAs and the Golden Globes and the Toronto Film Festival. So it's very parallel.
Right. So you're going to the Oscars this year? Are you going to be on the scene?
I am. Yeah. So I started going for the New Yorker in 2017, and now I go more or less every year. I did finally buy a tux, because I had been renting a tux every year from Men's Warehouse and then expensing it, because I didn't think I would keep going back and back. And then finally this year I thought, well, it seems like I'm going to the Oscars every year and I need a tux. So I actually bought one, a very fancy Men's Warehouse number. So I'll be really wowing them on the red carpet.
Right. Yeah, well, hopefully there'll be some giant unexpected catastrophe this year. I don't know what it could be, but
let's hope. I mean, I'm a lover of Oscar drama and chaos.
Yeah. So in terms of just writing the book itself, and this is something I struggle with a bit. I mean, how do you sort of go about dividing up your time between working on the book and doing your regular work for the magazine, or did you just take time off?
I didn't. I mean, it's impossible. It was horrible. Honestly, it took me 4 years to write the book. I was about 14 months late with it. Fortunately, HarperCollins was not too worried about that until they finally were like, if we want this out for the 2023 Oscars, you need to have it in by X date. And I was like, but no, I mean, I didn't take a book leave, and the New Yorker keeps me very busy, and it was really hard to do both. So I selfishly want to ask you, how do you do it?
Well, yeah, by taking 10 years to read each book, which is sort of not the best solution. But it is. I mean, I've never taken a real book leave. For my first book, I took a sort of partial leave. I stopped writing longer pieces and just sort of wrote a bunch of sort of shorter columns for about 6 months, and I was still getting paid, but I almost immediately ran out of money, which was one of the motivation not to do this again. And also, I don't think I actually got appreciably that much more done, than I would have just sort of continuing to work both on the book and some, shorter pieces side by side. I feel like I'm not one of these people who can disappear into a cabin in the woods, and work kind of full time. I feel like it would just turn out like The Shining, but not as exciting. Not as exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of it as not just a time management problem, but a psychological problem because, well, I always think of it like writing an article, even a long New Yorker article, is sort of like swimming in a lap pool. And then writing a book is like deep sea diving. Like you have to go down very slowly. You have to come up very slowly, or else like the pressure changes and your head explodes or something. And like just thinking about like when I'm writing a book, like I want to get immersed in it and like dream about it and like feel like there's this alternative universe that I'm living in. And it's so hard to do that. And then also like crank out a profile or a talk of the town piece, like because there's always something that is due like that week, or that month, that is begging for your attention.
Yeah, what I've done with the books, the two longer books that I've written, has been really to sort of carve out periods of time, maybe sort of a few weeks, where I sort of front load my schedule. I get a lot of kind of magazine writing done, and then there's a little bit of a pause before the sort of next major assignment comes along, and so I can kind of plunge in, and it is a little bit of a deadline. Like I know that fairly soon the window is going to close, and I'm going to have to go back to my next magazine assignment. So the motivation to get say most of a chapter written, or at least to make some kind of progress, and it also maybe seems to help for me to work very hard on an aspect of it, then step away, and then come back a month later, a couple of months later, and continue working.
Yeah, so it's like you have to hold a lot in your head, and if you start to spread yourself too thin, you just lose like all the stuff you have stored up in your brain that is for the book.
Yeah. And when I would sit down to go back to it, I mean, I always have to allow for a few days of just basically like opening up the file for the chapter on my computer, staring at it, sighing in despair, and closing it. It's like it would take me a few days to like even feel as though it wasn't completely hopeless, that I could sort of step back into it. But yeah, it is sort of difficult to strike the balance. But I haven't, for this new project, I'm still at the stage of accumulating kind of monstrous piles of material. So that's something I can do in between everything else very, very easily. I just always have another book that I'm reading or another movie that I'm going to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to ask you, Alex. So my first book, Her Again, it was very contained, and I actually did take off work, and I just spent a year and a half just working on it. It's about Meryl Streep's life in the 70s, so it was short. I got it done fast, and I was basically only thinking about that. But this book is a big, sprawling history that took a lot of years. It covers a century of cultural history, and is sort of large in scope. And you have written two books that are very large and sweeping in scope. And I mean, like, how did you get through it? Because I had definitely many points in like the middle where I just told myself, like, is this ever going to be over? Like, is this ever going to be done? Is this ever going to be like in any sort of shape? It just, you get to this sort of middle place where it just seems totally impossible and hopeless. And then I just kept going and going until I finally just was finished and got to the end, and then sort of looked back on this horrifically large file and like tried to turn it into something. But I'm curious to hear about how you navigated that process of just writing a big, long book with tons and tons of history covering decades and decades.
Oh no, I had many moments of just sort of total despair and panic about it in the middle. I mean, the thing about writing the magazine articles, even the long articles that go for 5,000 words or more, I could always kind of see the whole thing in my head. Just after kind of working for a bit, after doing my research and kind of making some notes, and just sort of out in the world jogging or some other activity, I'd be kind of thinking over the piece, and I can sort of see the shape of it. There's a few different components that are going to fit together, and okay, I have a sense of where it's going to begin and where it's going to end. And that's just a great kind of there's a sense of security, you know, as you go about sort of writing the piece itself, that you can sort of see it in here. The books, I can never see the whole thing in my head, you know. And it was sort of this scary process of discovery, you know, sort of my initial idea of what the book might be versus what was emerging, you know, on paper, which seemed to have just kind of a momentum of its own, you know, a kind of and a sort of there'd be a certain voice that's, you know, starts to emerge that is kind of unique to this book, you know, or just turning in different directions. And so, I mean, I've learned to be comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing how exactly it's all going to turn out, and moments in the middle of it where I feel like it's just, you know, completely hopeless, you know, because, well, I've sort of come through this before, so presumably I'll come through this again. But
well, yeah, but you started out like this. I mean, you know, my first book, I was like not convinced I could even write a book, so I chose like a very containable subject. I was like, it's about one person, it's about 10 years in her life. I know I can get to the end of this. But, you know, you came out of the gate with like, oh, a book about the history of like the entire century of music. I mean,
right. Well, no, but it
what
wasn't
possessed you to-
easy. There was like a infamous meeting that I had with my editor at I think the Uniscore Cafe or somewhere, where I was sort of in the middle of it, and I was kind of having a crisis, and we still joke about this, that I just kind of, I started kind of like shaking in the middle of the lunch. It was just kind of like having almost like a sort of live nervous breakdown in front of him as I was, you know, discussing the condition of the book. So yeah, so that, I mean, I really did almost lose my mind with that first book. The second one, which was even more protracted, was, you know, nonetheless, I kind of had faith that something was going to emerge, no matter how unmanageable.
Well, how long did each of them take?
The first one took 7 years in this, and Wagnerism. The second book, listen to this, just a bunch of essays. So it was with some original material, but basically a completely different kind of undertaking. And the third book, Wagnerism, did take 10 years. But
Jesus, 10 years.
But it was a kind of, what I learned also is that you just kind of, you're putting one brick on top of another. It just felt like, you know, a construction project, you know, and that
Yeah.
I became, with the books, I just have to be much less hung up on the sort of finery of each sentence. And actually, I think, you know, a book that is sort of written in the same way as a magazine article, where sort of at the beginning of each chapter, you're sort of to do something to kind of grab the reader's attention, and sort of these sort of verbal fireworks, and then, you know, then some more verbal fireworks at the end. You know, I think a book written that way is tiring. And I think, you know, with a book, I realized I can actually simplify my language, just be much more expository, and it really is sort of putting one thing on top of another, and just sort of creating this mountain of material, and then shaping it. And for me, it sometimes feels like I'm just creating the illusion that there's some argument here, there's some sort of sense of direction for how this sort of chapter fits in with the next, and looks, you know, these little tricks. But you know, each of these books, I've been so in love with the material itself that sort of keeps me going. You know, I enjoy the immersion.
And what did it feel like to actually bring them out into the world? Because if you're saying this is 10 years of your life on Wagnerism, I mean, I thought 4 years was a lot, you know, and I'm looking at parts of this book and thinking, wow, I wrote this in 2018. That was a long time ago, you know, before the pandemic, before, you know, like, you know, my nephew wasn't born, my grandmother was alive. It's like so many things have changed since then. Like, this is a different person who was writing about, you know, the 1951 Best Actress race, but people are now responding to it now. They're reading it now, and as all one giant thing. And it's strange, you know, it's strange to have like this one containable thing that you know, encompasses a very long, drawn out period of my own life. And I'm curious how that felt for you to actually like one day it's in bookstores, you know.
Right. Well, it was very different, you know, with the two books, for various reasons. I mean, the first book was surprisingly successful, given the sort of somewhat, you know, obscure subject matter. And I was just very lucky to have a kind of amazing experience with it. And the sort of year afterward, where there's continuing kind of attention to the book. And Wagnerism had the bad luck to come out, in the fall of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, the presidential election, George Floyd, everything else, and so it just didn't quite feel like the moment where everyone wanted to focus on a problematic 19th century German composer and his enormous and complicated legacy. And I wasn't able to enjoy any of the kind of just, going to bookstores and seeing the book and talking, to people speaking in bookstores. So it was a bit sad, in that sense. But also you also learn this detachment, and you can sort of devote 10 years of your life to one book, and it's kind of a phenomenon, and you devote 10 years to another, and it's less of a phenomenon. But I feel fundamentally lucky to be doing this at all. I'm just amazed every day that people are still letting me write about the stuff that I care about, and that I'm able to publish books, and sort of everything else is kind of extra, so that's sort of the way I try to keep sane through the ups and downs.
Well, I'm impressed that you're already on to the next one, because I feel like I've just panted to the finish line, and now I just want to, see what it's like to have one full-time job, which is being a New Yorker writer and not having a big book deadline over my head, and that will take years and years. I know I'll get the hunger back, to do something like that, especially now that I know I can get to the finish line of a, sweeping history. But man, do I not feel in the mood right now to do that.
Well, of course you don't. Yeah, I mean, after each of my big books, I've sworn never to do it again. And why not just have one job? They pay me fine and use the extra time to go for walks. But yeah, it took a couple of years before the kind of the hunger came back, and I launched into this new project. But yeah, just the opportunity to delve into something so deeply, and sort of to devote years of your life to exploring every facet of it, and then sort of using actually relatively little of the material you accumulated. You can never fit it all into the book, but somehow it's not lost. It's kind of just been this education that you've undertaken for yourself, which just enriches yourself. I especially felt that with Wagnerism. I felt like I was just vastly enriched by the process of writing that book. It just opened up so many kind of new avenues to me. I'm sure that's been the case for you too. That and then somehow there's usually kind of in each book there's like a seed of the next one. So maybe somewhere in your Oscar book is kind of your next book, kind of waiting to come out.
I don't know, maybe. I mean, my first book got its title from Meryl Streep's Oscar speech.
True. Yeah.
Her again, when she said, "Oh," when they called my name, I was like, I could hear half of America going, "Oh, come on, why her again?"
Right.
But whatever. I was in love with her Oscar speech, her award speeches. I used to memorize them, and that kind of is what, that in a roundabout way, it got me to write that book about her. And then, it opens with the 2016 Academy Awards when she won. 2016. Wait, no, 2012 Academy Awards when she won for The Iron Lady. So I don't know. Maybe there's some seed of something in this very large book, Oscar Wars. But right now, I just want to take a nap.
Of course, yeah. Well, yeah, a little later after all of the book launch festivities, we'll be able to nap. But that's a fantastic book. Congratulations so much on pulling so much Hollywood history, together with the history of the Oscars themselves. It's the kind of story where you sometimes you're using the Oscars itself, the Oscar itself, as a way into all these other stories, and as a way of sort of connecting them together. So I think it really works beautifully that way.
Well, thanks, Alex. Thanks for reading it. Than's for chatting.
Sure.
It's great to see you. And
Yep.
yeah, I gotta make it to SKYLIT next time I'm in town. If I have time when I'm going to attend the Oscars, and I have to do a lot of work, but I'm pretty sure I have some signed copies there.
You sure do. Thank you both. That was an incredible discussion. Such a pleasure, such a joy to listen to. Michael, I had a quick question while I was listening. We've got the Academy Awards coming up, the 95th edition, as you mentioned. Um, what lesson did you learn while writing this book that you are excited to apply to this year's ceremony?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the subtext with this year is about Hollywood's anxiety about how movies are consumed now. I mean, it's been such a tumultuous years, especially with the pandemic, the rise of streaming. I don't, people don't quite know what a movie is anymore, much less how to make people go see them. And I think you see that in the nominees this year. Like for Best Picture, you have these gigantic big franchise movies like Avatar and Top Gun against like Tar and Women Talking. And it's like, I think that, and those little movies just are not making money at the box office. And you don't have a lot of movies in the middle anymore, like the mid-budget adult dramas that studios used to make, like Kramer versus Kramer and Terms of Endearment. And I think maybe the reason, or one of the reasons that Everything Ever All at Once has really broken out is because it's kind of the exception to all those rules. Like it's this original movie that's a big spectacle, and but it's an indie movie, and it's a big box office hit, and it also has a lot of heart and great characters, and it's about an Asian middle-aged immigrant, and and her queer daughter. I mean, it's kind of has this like crazy whole package of things, and I think people are in the industry are gravitating to it because it's like the unicorn that may point the way forward for this very weird moment in movies, or it may just be a way of forgetting that those problems exist for a brief glorious moment.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Alex. This has been a blast. I'm even more excited for the Oscars now. Just a reminder to all of our listeners, you can stop by Skylight Books to pick up a signed copy of Oscar Wars. You could also visit our website and purchase any of Michael's or Alex's books. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Michael, have fun wearing that tux that you bought, and have a good day, too.
Thank you. It's great to chat.
Thanks, Mick. Thanks, Alex. Great to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Skylight Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylightbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.